Ambassador Crix, 9 adjusted his breathing apparatus for the third time in 5 minutes, watching the human delegation file into the Grand Assembly Hall like they owned the place. Which, technically speaking, they absolutely did not. The Galactic Council had been running this galaxy for over 12,000 cycles, thank you very much, and these bipedal newcomers had been space-worthy for what? A few hundred rotations around their little yellow star? Confidence, muttered High Counselor Vex Prime from her floating platform, her tentacles twitching with what could charitably be called amusement. You have to admire their confidence. Crix, 9 wasn't sure admiration was the right word. The humans had requested this emergency session, citing urgent diplomatic concerns regarding the recent incidents in the Outer Rim territories. Incidents that, coincidentally, involved human colonies being asked politely to relocate. For their own safety, of course. The Council had been very clear about that. The lead human, a woman with graying hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the chamber, stepped forward. Ambassador Elena Vasquez, if Crix 9's files were correct. She'd been described as reasonable in previous negotiations. Reasonable was good. Reasonable humans were manageable. Honored counselors, Vasquez began, her voice carrying easily through the vast chamber without amplification. Curious. Most species required the translation matrix to project properly. We appreciate you taking time from your busy schedules to address our concerns. See? Reasonable. Polite, even, Counselor Threxka, whose species had evolved from apex predators and still looked the part, leaned forward on his perch. Of course, Ambassador. The Council always has time for dialogue. Though I confess curiosity about the urgency of your request. Vasquez smiled. It was a pleasant expression, showing just enough teeth to be friendly without being threatening. Humans were remarkably good at that particular balance. Well, Counselor, it seems there's been some confusion about our colonies in the Kepler sector. Confusion? Vex Prime's eye stalk swiveled toward the human. The relocation orders were quite clear. Environmental hazards, unstable stellar phenomena, the usual concerns. For your own protection, naturally. Naturally, Vasquez agreed, nodding sagely. Though our scientists seem to have missed these hazards entirely. Funny thing about that. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop a degree or two. Crix, 9 noticed that the other humans in the delegation had spread out slightly, adopting what his tactical training recognized as defensive positions. But their faces remained pleasantly neutral, almost bored. Science can be subjective, offered Counselor Zelmoth, his crystalline form shimmering with diplomatic uncertainty. Perhaps human instruments lack the sensitivity to detect the dangers we've identified. Perhaps, Vasquez said, her smile unwavering. Or perhaps the danger isn't environmental at all. The silence that followed could have been cut with a vibrational blade and served at a formal dinner. Crix, 9 felt his secondary hearts beginning to race. This was not going according to the usual script. Threxka's claws extended slightly. I'm not sure I understand your implication, Ambassador. Oh, I think you understand perfectly. Vasquez turned to address the full council, her voice still perfectly reasonable, perfectly polite. See, when 12 different human colonies receive relocation orders within the same standard month, all citing different but equally urgent environmental threats, well, it starts to look like a pattern. Vex Prime's tentacles coiled tighter around her platform's controls. The Council's decisions are based on comprehensive data analysis and the welfare of all galactic citizens. Including the welfare of the Zenthari Mining Consortium? Another human stepped forward, a tall man with scars across his neck that suggested survival of something unpleasant. The nameplate identified him as Captain Marcus Stone. Because it's interesting how their survey teams showed up in our systems about a week after we got those evacuation orders. Crix, 9 checked his files again. Stone's record was extensive. Military background, special operations, the kind of human who'd seen the darker corners of space and come back with stories. Not the reasonable type at all. The Zenthari Consortium is a legitimate commercial entity, Zelmoth protested, his shimmer taking on anxious hues. Their activities are properly regulated and authorized. Authorized to strip mine inhabited worlds? Stone's voice carried a new edge, like metal being slowly drawn from a sheath. Because that's what they're planning. We have the surveys. We have the communications. We have everything. The humans had done their homework. That was problematic. Threxka rose to his full, impressive height, claws fully extended now. Even if such allegations were true, which they are not, the Council's authority in these matters is absolute. The relocation orders stand. And that, Crix 9 realized with growing dread, was the exact moment Ambassador Vasquez's polite expression finally changed. It wasn't dramatic. No snarling, no shouting, no dramatic gestures. Her smile simply disappeared. Her eyes went flat. When she spoke again, her voice carried the same pleasant tone, but something fundamental had shifted underneath it. I see, she said quietly. So we're done pretending this is about our safety. Ambassador, Vex Prime began, but Vasquez raised one finger. Just one finger. Somehow, it was enough to silence a being who commanded star fleets. No, no. Please. Let me make sure I understand the situation. Vasquez began walking, pacing slowly in front of the Council's elevated platforms. You found some valuable resources in our space. You want us gone so your friends can dig them up. And when we ask nicely about it, you basically tell us to shut up and move. The Council's decisions are final, Threxka growled, but his aggressive posture had shifted slightly. Something in his predator instincts was apparently suggesting caution. Final, Vasquez repeated, nodding thoughtfully. Right. Well, that's unfortunate. Because you seem to be operating under a fundamental misunderstanding about how this works. Captain Stone stepped up beside her. You think we're just going to pack up and leave because you said so. A third human joined them, a woman whose badge identified her as Dr. Sarah Winters. You think we don't have options? You think, said a fourth voice, and Crix 9's blood chilled as he recognized the speaker, that we're still being polite because we have to be. Admiral Rebecca Cross stepped into the light, and suddenly the entire dynamic of the chamber shifted. Cross was a legend, even among the Council's military advisors. The human who'd held off 3 Kralex battle fleets with a damaged cruiser and a lot of creative cursing. The architect of the Proxima Station defense that had redefined modern combat tactics, she looked utterly relaxed, hands clasped behind her back, expression mildly interested. Which, according to every psychological profile Crix 9 had ever read about human military leaders, was absolutely terrifying. Oh, Vex Prime whispered, her tentacles going very still. See, here's what I think happened, Ambassador Vasquez continued, her voice still perfectly conversational. You've been dealing with humans for what, 50 standard years? And we've been polite. Reasonable. We follow protocols, we respect boundaries, we try to work within your systems. She paused, her pacing directly in front of Threxka's platform. And somewhere along the way, you forgot that politeness is a choice. The silence stretched. Crix 9 could hear his own breathing apparatus cycling, could feel the collective tension of every council member present. This wasn't how diplomatic sessions went. This wasn't how any of this was supposed to work. Admiral Cross spoke again, her voice carrying the kind of casual authority that came from commanding fleets in actual combat. The thing about humans, counselors, is that we really prefer to solve problems peacefully. It's so much more efficient. Less paperwork. Fewer awkward questions at family gatherings. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the chamber from some of the junior staff. Even in the face of what was rapidly becoming a diplomatic crisis, humans somehow managed to be funny. But, Cross continued, when peaceful solutions are taken off the table by others, well, we adapt. Dr. Winters pulled out a data pad, consulting it with the air of someone checking a grocery list. Admiral, should I tell them about the fleet movements, or do you want to? Oh, you go ahead, Doctor. You explain things so much better than I do. Winters smiled brightly. Thank you. Counselors, in the last 72 hours, human naval assets have taken up positions around every major hyperspace junction leading to the Kepler sector. Not blocking them, of course. That would be rude. Just monitoring traffic. For safety. Crix 9's primary heart stopped beating for a moment. You're threatening a blockade. Threatening? Ambassador Vasquez looked genuinely surprised. Counselor, we would never threaten anyone. We're simply ensuring the safety of our colonies during this period of uncertainty. You understand how dangerous space can be. The audacity was breathtaking. They were using the Council's own rhetoric against them, wrapped in the same polite language and reasonable tone, but they weren't done. Captain Stone stepped forward, producing his own data pad. Speaking of safety, we've also taken the liberty of sharing some information with our neighbors. The Altari Federation was particularly interested to learn about the Zenthari Consortium's expansion plans. Apparently, several Altari systems are on the target list too. The Vegan Republic had similar concerns, Dr. Winters added helpfully. As did the Free Merchants Alliance. Funny how these things spread once people start talking. Vexprime's eye stalks were swiveling frantically between the humans. You've violated diplomatic protocols by sharing classified information. Admiral Cross tilted her head slightly. What classified information? The surveyed data the Zenthari filed with the Commerce Ministry? The mining permits they requested through public channels? The fleet deployment orders that went through standard communications networks? She paused, letting the implications sink in. Counselor, if you wanted this kept secret, you probably shouldn't have put it all in writing. And that was when Crix 9 realized the horrible truth. The humans hadn't stumbled onto some conspiracy. They hadn't gotten lucky with intelligence gathering. They'd been watching. Waiting. Documenting everything. For how long? Ambassador Vasquez resumed her pacing, but her posture had changed completely. The diplomatic mask was gone, replaced by something that reminded Crix 9 uncomfortably of the apex predators from his homeworld. The kind that played with their prey before the kill. So here's where we stand, she said, her voice still maddeningly reasonable. You want our colonies gone. We want to stay. You have the legal authority to make us leave. We have the practical ability to make that complicated. Threxka's claws were fully extended now, but Crix 9 noticed that the Predator's stance had shifted from aggressive to defensive. You're openly defying the Council's authority. Are we? Vasquez stopped pacing and faced him directly. Counselor, we haven't violated a single law. We haven't threatened anyone. We haven't blocked any trade routes or interfered with any legitimate operations. We've simply positioned ourselves to protect our interests. And informed our neighbors about potential threats to their interests too. It's called networking, Captain Stone added. Very popular among younger species. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop another few degrees. Crix 9 found himself wondering if the humans had somehow hacked the environmental controls too. At this point, nothing would surprise him. What happened next would be discussed in xenopsychology courses for generations to come. Not because it was particularly violent or dramatic, but because it represented the exact moment an entire galactic civilization realized they'd been thinking about humans completely wrong. Doctor Winters consulted her data pad again, her expression brightening as if she'd just remembered something pleasant. Oh, Admiral, should we mention the economic projections? Economic projections? Zelmotha's crystalline form flickered with nervous energy. What economic projections? Admiral Cross smiled, and Crix, 9 was suddenly reminded of his childhood nightmares about deep-sea predators. Well, Counselor, it's interesting what happens when you start looking at the numbers. The Zenthari Consortium's mining operations depend pretty heavily on stable hyperspace routes, don't they? Of course they do, Vex Prime snapped, her tentacles coiling tighter. All interstellar commerce does. Right. But here's the thing. Captain Stone stepped forward, his scarred hands gesturing casually. Those routes? They don't just run through Council space. Funny how that works. Ambassador Vasquez had stopped pacing and was now standing perfectly still in the center of the chamber. When she spoke, her voice carried across the vast space without effort. See, when we started reaching out to our neighbors about this situation, we discovered something fascinating. The Altari Federation controls 3 of the 7 major hyperspace junctions the Zenthari need for their expansion. The Vegan Republic controls 2 more. And the Free Merchants Alliance, Dr. Winters added cheerfully, controls the primary shipping lanes for processed materials. Such a small galaxy, isn't it? The silence that followed was deafening. Crix, 9 could practically hear the gears turning in every council member's head as they realized the implications. Counselor Zelmoth was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. You've built a coalition. Coalition? Ambassador Vasquez looked genuinely puzzled. Counselor, we've simply had some very productive conversations with our neighbors. It turns out lots of species have concerns about aggressive mining operations in their regions. Concerns, Admiral Cross continued, that could potentially affect their willingness to provide services to companies engaged in such activities. Threxka's claws scraped against his platform. You're threatening economic warfare. Threatening? Captain Stone laughed, and the sound echoed strangely in the vast chamber. Counselor, we're not threatening anything. We're just pointing out that business relationships are built on trust. And trust, well, that's a fragile thing. Dr. Winters nodded sagely. For instance, if the Altari Federation became concerned about the environmental impact of certain mining operations, they might need to reassess their hyperspace junction fees. For safety reasons, of course. And the Vegan Republic has been considering new regulations on cargo manifests, Ambassador Vasquez added. Something about preventing the transport of materials from ecologically sensitive areas. Very forward-thinking of them. The Free Merchants Alliance is particularly concerned about insurance rates, Admiral Cross finished. Apparently, operations in disputed territories carry much higher premiums. Who knew? Crix, 9 felt his breathing apparatus cycling faster. The humans weren't just threatening to resist the relocation orders. They were threatening to strangle the entire operation economically, using legal methods and willing partners. It was elegant, ruthless, and completely within the bounds of Interstellar. LAW.IT was also, he realized with growing horror, probably just the beginning. Vex Prime's voice was strained when she spoke. What exactly do you want? Ambassador Vasquez tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question for the first time. Want? Counselor, we want exactly what we've always wanted. To be left alone to develop our colonies in peace. To trade freely with our neighbors. To contribute to galactic civilization as equal partners. She paused, letting the words sink in. What we don't want is to be told to pack up and leave so your friends can strip mine our homes. The Zenthari Consortium has legal rights to those systems, Threxka insisted, but his aggressive posture had crumbled entirely. He looked more like a cornered scavenger than an apex predator now. Do they? Dr. Winters consulted her data pad again. Because we've been looking into that. Fascinating reading, Interstellar Mining Law. Did you know there are over 300 subsections dealing with prior habitation rights? Captain Stone grinned, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Subsection 47C is particularly interesting. Something about established colonies having precedence over resource extraction permits. Unless, of course, the inhabitants consent to relocation. Which we don't, Ambassador Vasquez said simply. But surely, Zelmotha's crystalline form was flickering rapidly now, reasonable beings can reach a compromise. Perhaps shared development rights, or compensation packages, compensation. Admiral Cross repeated the word like she was tasting something unpleasant. For our homes. For our communities. For the lives we've built. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow every being in the chamber heard her clearly. Counselor, let me tell you something about humans. We don't handle forced relocation well. We have historical issues with that concept. The temperature in the chamber seemed to plummet. Crix 9 had read human history. He knew what she was referring to. Every species that had ever tried to forcibly relocate human populations had learned, eventually, that it was a mistake, usually the hard way. Ambassador Vasquez stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice carried a finality that made Crix 9 scales itch. So here's what's going to happen. The relocation orders will be rescinded. The Zenthri Consortium will find other systems to exploit, ones that don't happen to be occupied. And the Council will remember that humanity didn't join this organization to be pushed around. And if we refuse? Vexprime's tentacles were trembling now. The humans exchanged glances. Not worried glances. Not uncertain glances. The kind of glances that teammates exchange when they've practiced a play so many times they could run it in their sleep. Dr. Winters spoke first. Well, the economic situation would become challenging. Mining operations are expensive. When hyperspace routes become unreliable, when shipping costs triple, when insurance rates skyrocket, projects tend to become unviable. Captain Stone nodded thoughtfully. And there's the legal angle. Turns out a lot of species are interested in challenging the precedent of forced relocations. Could tie things up in courts for decades. Admiral Cross smiled, and Crix 9 realized that this was what human military leaders looked like when they were absolutely certain of victory. And then there's the practical consideration. Human colonies don't relocate well. We tend to resist. Sometimes that resistance spreads to other species who suddenly realize they might be next. You're threatening rebellion, Threxka whispered. Rebellion? Ambassador Vasquez looked genuinely shocked. Counselor, we're threatening nothing. We're simply explaining the likely consequences of certain policy decisions. The Council is, of course, free to make whatever choices it sees fit. She paused, her expression softening slightly. But you should probably know that 3 more species have requested emergency council sessions this week. Something about reviewing resource extraction policies in their territories. Funny how these concerns spread once people start talking. The chamber fell silent again. Crix 9 could hear his own heart's beating, could feel the collective weight of the Council's realization settling over them like a heavy blanket. The humans hadn't just prepared for this confrontation. They'd prepared for the war that would follow. Economic war, legal war, political war. They'd built alliances, gathered intelligence, identified pressure points, and constructed a response so comprehensive that resistance seemed futile, and they'd done it all while maintaining perfect diplomatic courtesy. Vexprime's voice was barely audible when she finally spoke. The relocation orders will be reviewed. Reviewed? Dr. Winters looked up from her data pad with interest. That's wonderful news, Counselor. How long do you think that review might take? Vexprime's tentacles were coiled so tightly they looked painful. Standard review procedures require 90 standard days. Oh, that's far too long, Ambassador Vasquez said sympathetically. Our neighbors are quite concerned about the situation. Waiting 3 months for resolution might force them to take protective measures in the meantime. Protective measures that could significantly impact shipping schedules, Captain Stone added helpfully. And insurance rates, Dr. Winters noted. And legal proceedings, Admiral Cross finished. Threxka's claws had retracted completely. His voice, when he spoke, sounded defeated. How long? Ambassador Vasquez pretended to consider the question. Well, I suppose if the council moved quickly, say, 72 hours, that might be sufficient time to demonstrate good faith. Enough to reassure our partners that the situation is being handled appropriately. 72 hours to overturn established policy? 72 hours to correct a mistake, Admiral Cross said quietly. Before that mistake becomes very, very expensive for everyone involved. The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Not because the council suddenly developed a conscience about forced relocations, but because the alternative was economic warfare against a species that had just demonstrated they understood leverage better than beings who'd been playing galactic politics for millennia. As the humans filed out of the chamber, maintaining their polite, diplomatic demeanor to the very end, Crix 9 found himself wondering how many other, polite, species might be quietly building similar networks. How many other civilizations were watching this exchange and taking notes, but mostly, he wondered how the council had managed to mistake human courtesy for human weakness for so long. Ambassador Vasquez paused at the chamber entrance, turning back to address the council one final time. Her voice carried clearly across the vast space, warm and professional and absolutely terrifying in its implications. Thank you for your time, counselors. We look forward to continuing our productive relationship. The door sealed behind the human delegation with a soft hiss, leaving the council in stunned silence. It would be hours before anyone spoke. Days before they fully understood what had just happened. And years before they stopped checking every policy decision against the question, how would the humans respond to this? Because as it turned out, when humanity's polite mode finally switched off, what emerged wasn't rage or violence or dramatic threats, what emerged was competence. Pure, calculated, absolutely ruthless competence, and somehow, that was infinitely more terrifying than any show of force could have been.